The ruins of Settlement 7 still smoked when Dr. Thomas Reed arrived with his medical supplies and portable scanner. The bombardment had ended maybe 6 hours ago, long enough for the fires to burn themselves out, not long enough for the bodies to stop being warm. Thomas had been doing this for 8 months on Kesara, moving between destroyed settlements with his field hospital, treating whoever he could reach before the next wave of violence swept through. He still wasn't numb to it. Every destroyed settlement felt like a personal failure, like he should have been faster, should have convinced more people to evacuate, should have somehow prevented the violence that turned homes into rubble and families into statistics. But dwelling on should-haves didn't help the survivors who needed him now. Thomas climbed carefully over shattered walls and through collapsed doorways, his scanner searching for life signs. The device pinged weakly, faint but present, about 40 meters into the ruins. He followed the signal medical kit bouncing against his hip until he found her half buried in rubble. She was clearly alien but humanoid enough that his brain registered her as a woman. Tall, probably close to 7 feet when standing, with the elongated ears common to several species in this sector. Her clothing was burned and torn beyond recognition, and blood had dried dark against skin that had a faint iridescent quality beneath the dirt and ash. Thomas didn't recognize her species immediately, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the trauma. Deep lacerations across her torso and arms, probable broken ribs given how carefully she was breathing, signs of severe concussion, and blood loss that should have killed her already. He knelt beside her, scanner confirming she was somehow still alive despite injuries that would have been fatal to most species. "Hey," he said gently, touching her shoulder. "Can you hear me? I'm a doctor. I'm going to help you." Her eyes opened, amber color that seemed to glow faintly, and focused on him with surprising clarity given her head trauma. She tried to speak, managed only a whisper he couldn't hear over the settling debris around them. "Don't talk," Thomas said, already unpacking his medical kit. "Just stay still. You're hurt badly, but I can stabilize you." He worked quickly, hands moving with practiced efficiency born from too many months of exactly this kind of emergency medicine. Broad-spectrum pain medication first, then biofoam for the worst lacerations, an inflatable brace for the ribs, IV fluids for the blood loss. His scanner showed internal bleeding that would need surgery, but he could manage that back at the clinic if he could just keep her alive for the transport. The woman watched him work, her amber eyes never leaving his face, and Thomas found the intensity of her gaze unsettling in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Like she was cataloging everything about him, analyzing, judging. But he was too focused on keeping her alive to worry about why a dying refugee would look at him like that. "All right," he said after stabilizing the worst of her injuries. "You're stable enough to move. My clinic is about 3 kilometers from here. Think you can stay conscious for the trip?" She managed a slight nod, and Thomas activated his transport sled, a hovering stretcher designed to navigate rubble, and carefully shifted her onto it. She made a sound that might have been pain or protest, but she didn't resist. The trip back took 40 minutes of careful navigation. Thomas kept up a stream of quiet commentary, partly to keep her conscious and partly to calm his own nerves. He talked about the clinic, about the other refugees she'd meet, about how she'd be safe there. She didn't respond, but her eyes stayed open, tracking his movements with that same intense focus that made him feel like a specimen under examination. The clinic was a converted warehouse in what had been Settlement 7's industrial district, far enough from strategic targets to be relatively safe, close enough to the fighting that refugees could reach it. Thomas had maybe 20 patients currently, plus a handful of volunteers who helped with basic care. Maya, his most capable assistant, met him at the entrance and took one look at his patient before saying, "Treatment room 2. I'll prep surgical." They worked through the night. The woman's injuries were even worse than initial assessment suggested: internal bleeding from multiple sources, fractured vertebrae, burns from some kind of energy weapon that had partially cauterized as it damaged. But her physiology was remarkably resilient. Her bones were denser than human standard, her musculature incredibly developed, and her cellular regeneration was operating at speeds Thomas had never documented before. "She's a fighter," Maya observed, watching the cellular scans with fascination. "Look at this bone density, this muscle definition. This woman's been in serious combat training her entire life." Thomas didn't look up from the delicate work of repairing internal damage. Lots of people have been. War makes soldiers out of everyone eventually. They finished around dawn, the woman stable and resting under anesthesia. Thomas stood beside her bed for a long moment, exhausted and running on coffee and adrenaline, studying her face. Even injured and unconscious, she held herself with dignity that suggested someone used to respect. Her features were striking, strong cheekbones, a jawline that suggested determination, and those unusual amber eyes behind closed lids. There was something almost regal about her, something that made Thomas think of old earth paintings of warrior queens from humanity's distant past. "Wonder who she was before all this," Maya said quietly, echoing his thoughts. "Does it matter?" Thomas asked, though he was wondering the same thing. "She's a refugee now, that's all that counts." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. She woke 3 days later, and her first word was water. Thomas brought her a cup, helping her sit up enough to drink without aggravating her healing ribs. "Easy," he cautioned, supporting her shoulders. "You've been out for a while. Your injuries were severe." She drank carefully, her eyes surveying the room with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained in tactical assessment. Thomas watched her catalog the medical equipment, the other patients in nearby beds, the refugee volunteers moving between them, the security weaknesses in the warehouse's converted structure. Everything processed and filed away with efficient precision. When she finished the water, she looked at Thomas directly. "You saved me," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse but carried an accent Thomas didn't recognize. Sharp consonants, musical vowels, the kind of accent that suggested education and authority. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because you were injured," he said, as if the answer was obvious. "I'm a doctor, that's what I do. You don't know me. Don't know which side I fought for, what I've done, whether I deserved saving. How do you know I wasn't someone who caused suffering rather than experienced it?" Thomas pulled up a chair beside her bed, settling in with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before with other refugees struggling with survivor's guilt. "I don't get to decide who deserves healing," he said quietly. "Everyone who comes through that door gets treated, no questions asked. That's the deal. Galactic humanitarian law says medical personnel don't discriminate based on faction, species, or prior actions. But honestly, even without that law, I wouldn't turn you away. You were dying. I could help. That's enough." She studied him with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking past his words to the motivations beneath them. "That's naive," she said finally. "Dangerous, even. What if I'm an enemy combatant? What if I return to the fight and kill people you could have saved by letting me die?" "Then that's on you, not me," Thomas said simply. "My job is healing. What you do after you're healed is your choice. I don't get to play judge and jury based on hypothetical future actions." Something flickered across her expression, surprise, maybe, or something more complex that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. She was quiet for a long moment, and he got the sense she was evaluating him against some standard he didn't understand. "What's your name?" he asked, partly to break the silence and partly because he was genuinely curious about this unusual woman who seemed more interested in philosophy than recovery. She hesitated just briefly. "Kira," she said, just the single name, no family designation or cultural identifier. Thomas nodded, accepting it without pushing for more. "Well, Kira, I'm Thomas Reed. Welcome to the clinic. You'll be here for a while. Your injuries were extensive and you'll need time to heal properly. But you're going to recover fully if you follow medical advice. You sound very certain. You're incredibly resilient. Whatever species you are, you're built to survive trauma that would kill most beings I've treated. Your cellular regeneration alone is remarkable. I've never seen healing rates quite like yours." Again, that flicker of something in her expression. Discomfort, maybe, at having her unusual physiology remarked upon. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked, changing the subject with diplomatic skill. 3 days. You've been healing faster than I expected, actually. Another week and you'll be mobile. 2 weeks and you should be nearly back to full strength. And then you can stay here and help if you want, or move on to one of the larger refugee settlements. Your choice. We don't force anyone to leave unless there's a medical reason they need transfer to better facilities. Kira absorbed this information with the kind of strategic consideration that suggested she was already planning several steps ahead. Thomas filed that observation away with all the other things about her that didn't quite fit the standard refugee profile. Over the following days, as Kira recovered with the accelerated healing her physiology enabled, she watched Thomas work. She observed how he never stopped moving, treating patients, organizing supply deliveries, settling disputes among refugees, somehow maintaining his compassion despite being surrounded by suffering. The refugees clearly loved him. Children brought him their drawings, proud to show him their art. Adults sought his advice on matters far beyond medicine, disputes about resources, questions about resettlement, grief they needed to process. Everyone treated him with respect that had clearly been earned through consistent kindness rather than demanded through authority. Kira found it baffling. In her world, leaders commanded through strength and strategic brilliance, through demonstrated superiority and the power to reward or punish. Thomas led through something else entirely, through being relentlessly decent, through choosing to see people rather than problems, through believing that healing mattered more than winning. It was philosophically opposite to everything she'd been taught, and she couldn't stop analyzing it, trying to understand how this approach could possibly be effective. "Why do you do this?" she asked him one evening, when he collapsed in a chair beside her bed with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of weariness that came from caring too much for too long. "Do what?" he asked, taking a sip of the cold coffee and grimacing. "This, all of this. You're human, this isn't your war, these aren't your people. You could be anywhere else doing anything else. Why spend 8 months in a war zone treating refugees who can't pay you, who can't offer you anything beyond gratitude?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee like it held answers. "When I was in medical school," he said finally, "one of my professors told us that being a doctor meant watching people suffer, and you'd never be able to save everyone. He said the job would break you if you let it, so you had to learn emotional distance, professional detachment. Keep the patients at arm's length emotionally so their pain doesn't destroy you." "Sounds like reasonable advice," Kira said, though privately she thought it sounded like weakness disguised as wisdom. "I failed at that completely," Thomas admitted with a tired smile that held no regret. "I can't maintain professional distance. I care too much, feel too deeply, take every loss personally even when I know it's not productive. My professors thought it would burn me out within 5 years. Has it? Not yet. Maybe because I also see the victories. The people who survive, who rebuild, who find reasons to keep going despite everything they've lost. That matters more to me than the losses, even though the losses hurt like hell. Even when the war creates more suffering than you can heal, when your efforts are just drops in an ocean of casualties." Thomas met her eyes. "Especially then, because if I stop caring, if I walk away because the problem is too big, then the war wins. And I refuse to let that happen. Every person I help is a victory against the machinery of violence. That has to count for something." Kira, Queen Tharacin of the Varkari Dominion, though Thomas didn't know that, absorbed his words and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Shame. She'd spent her entire life as warrior and tactician, making strategic decisions that optimized military outcomes. Civilian casualties were regrettable but calculated, acceptable losses in service of larger strategic objectives. She'd never thought of them as individual victories lost, as people who could have been saved if different choices had been made. But Thomas made her see those acceptable losses as individual tragedies, as people with names and stories and futures that her decisions had erased. It was uncomfortable and enlightening in equal measure, forcing her to confront the human cost of decisions she'd justified through strategic necessity. By the end of her second week at the clinic, Tharacin was mobile again, still healing but functional. She started helping around the clinic despite Thomas's protests that she should rest more. She was surprisingly gentle with the children, patient with the elderly, and showed unexpected organizational skills that helped streamline the chaos of refugee management. Thomas found himself watching her during quiet moments, noticing things that didn't fit. The way she moved suggested not just combat training, but advanced martial disciplines. She had the fluid grace of someone who could kill efficiently, but chose gentleness instead. Her tactical awareness was impeccable, noting defensive weaknesses and suggesting improvements with casual expertise. And once, she'd redirected everyone to the reinforced basement 30 seconds before artillery fire landed close enough to rattle the windows, somehow sensing the attack before any warning systems activated. "You were military," Thomas said after that incident. It wasn't quite a question. Tharacin Kira met his eyes steadily. "I was many things before. Do you want to talk about it?" "No." The finality in her voice discouraged further questions, and Thomas nodded, respecting her need for privacy. Everyone had trauma they weren't ready to discuss. If Kira was a soldier trying to leave that life behind, trying to find a way to be something other than a weapon, he respected her need for distance from her past. What Thomas didn't know, Tharacin was using this time to study him, to understand the philosophy that drove his actions, to test whether his compassion was performance or genuine conviction. And increasingly, she was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, her culture, and the war she'd been fighting for 3 years. The Varkari valued strength above all else, honor earned through combat, decisive action that achieved clear objectives. They viewed mercy as weakness, enemies as obstacles to be eliminated efficiently, and war as the ultimate test of a civilization's worth. Tharacin had built her entire identity on those principles, had become the greatest warrior her people had ever produced by embracing that worldview completely and without doubt. But watching Thomas, who possessed no combat abilities, no physical advantages, no tactical training, achieve more through compassion than she'd achieved through military brilliance, forced her to question everything she'd believed about strength and effectiveness. Maybe strength wasn't just fighting. Maybe honor included mercy. Maybe enemies could be people worth saving rather than problems to be solved through violence. It was a dangerous line of thought for the queen of a warrior empire. Questioning fundamental cultural values was destabilizing, potentially treasonous if her doubts became known. But she couldn't stop the questions from arising, couldn't unsee what Thomas had shown her about alternative approaches to conflict and suffering. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that when her forces finally found her, and they would because Varkari military never abandoned their queen, everything would change. Thomas would learn who she really was. The trust they were building would shatter against the reality of the death she'd commanded, the destruction she'd ordered, the suffering she'd calculated as strategically acceptable. She dreaded that moment with an intensity that surprised her. She'd faced death in combat without fear, had made decisions affecting millions without hesitation. But the thought of seeing recognition and betrayal in Thomas's eyes when he learned her identity filled her with something uncomfortably close to fear. Not for her safety, for something more fragile that she'd thought she'd armored against years ago. She was starting to care what this human thought of her. And that was perhaps the most dangerous development of all, because it made her vulnerable in ways no weapon could exploit. The alarm came on her third week at the clinic, shattering the fragile peace she'd found in this place of healing. Thomas was in the middle of treating a child's infected wound when the warning sirens started. Incoming ships, military configuration, approaching at high speed. The refugees panicked immediately, muscle memory from too many bombardments sending them scrambling for the reinforced basement. Parents grabbed children, elderly helped each other, and within seconds the orderly clinic descended into controlled chaos. Thomas moved to the entrance, positioning himself between the door and his patients, with the kind of futile bravery that Narration had seen before in people who believed in principles more than survival. He was going to try to invoke humanitarian protection, to argue with whoever was coming that this was a medical facility under galactic law, protected territory that shouldn't be targeted. As if law mattered to military forces in the middle of war zones. Then Narration saw the ship configuration through the gaps in the warehouse walls, and her heart stopped. Those weren't coalition ships. Those were Valkyrie warships. Aggressive design unmistakable, weapons arrays that could level city blocks, the kind of military power that made weaker species surrender just by witnessing its deployment. They'd found her. After 3 weeks of searching, her forces had finally located their missing queen. Narration made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. She couldn't let Thomas face Valkyrie warriors unprepared, couldn't let her forces potentially harm him, because they didn't understand this place was sanctuary, couldn't let the refugees be terrorized by soldiers who might view them as enemy sympathizers for harboring their queen. She walked past Thomas toward the entrance, and everything about her changed in an instant. Her posture shifted from helpful refugee to absolute command, shoulders back and spine straight with the bearing of someone born to authority. Her expression became the mask she'd worn for 20 years of rule, emotionless, calculating, radiating power that made others instinctively defer. And when she moved, it was with the fluid, economical grace of a master warrior who could kill before most people processed the threat. "Kira, wait," Thomas started, reaching for her arm, but she was already outside. 4 Valkyrie warriors in full combat armor had landed, weapons ready, scanning for threats with the efficient paranoia of special forces. When they saw her, their entire demeanor changed instantly. They dropped to one knee in perfect synchronization, fists over hearts in the traditional salute, heads bowed in respect that bordered on worship. "Your Majesty," the squad leader said, and his voice carried relief and shock in equal measure. "We thought you dead. The entire Dominion has been searching. The Council has maintained emergency protocols, but there are factions attempting to claim succession rights based on your supposed death. Your return is desperately needed to stabilize the government. I am aware of the political complications my absence creates," Narration said, with the voice of command she hadn't used in 3 weeks, cold and authoritative and absolute. "Status report. How long have I been missing by official count?" 23 days, Your Majesty. We've searched 47 systems, investigated 1,200 potential locations, and lost 3 search teams to hostile action. Finding you alive is—" He paused, emotion cracking through military professionalism. "It's a miracle, Your Majesty." Through the warehouse walls, Narration could hear refugees whispering in fear, could practically feel Thomas's confusion and dawning horror even without seeing his face. She'd been living as Kira for 3 weeks, hiding her identity, pretending to be someone insignificant, letting him save her life and care about her without knowing who she actually was. Now he knew, or was about to, and everything would change. "Stand down," she ordered her warriors. "This facility is under my personal protection. No aggressive action toward anyone here. No threatening postures, weapons displayed. Is that absolutely clear?" The squad leader hesitated, clearly confused by protecting what appeared to be an enemy medical facility. "Your Majesty, our orders were to retrieve you immediately upon contact and return you to the capital." Your orders are now to secure a defensive perimeter around this facility and wait while I conclude business inside. Tharacin interrupted with the tone that ended discussions. No one enters or exits without my explicit permission. Is that clear, Commander? Yes, Your Majesty, crystal clear. The warriors moved to establish perimeter security, and Tharacin turned back toward the warehouse, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could delay this conversation, could simply leave with her forces and let Thomas wonder what had happened. It would be easier, cleaner, less painful for both of them. But she owed him honesty. He'd saved her life, shown her kindness, taught her things about mercy that had fundamentally changed how she viewed her role as queen. The least she could do was face his judgment directly rather than running from it like a coward. She walked back into the warehouse, and the refugees who'd emerged from the basement stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to terror to betrayal. Maya looked like she'd been physically struck, her face pale and her hands trembling. The children who'd brought her their drawings now hid behind their parents, afraid of the warrior queen they'd unknowingly befriended. But Thomas just stood there with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not fear, something more complicated that looked like emotional calculation happening in real time. "You're the Varkari queen," he said. Not a question, just processing information out loud. "Yes. The woman whose forces have been destroying coalition settlements for 3 years. Yes. The tactical genius whose military campaigns have killed millions, whose name is literally used to frighten children in coalition space, whose reputation is built on ruthless efficiency and total commitment to Varkari victory at any cost." Tharacin held his gaze, refusing to look away from the judgment she deserved. "Yes, I am Queen Tharacin of the Varkari Dominion, and you saved my life without knowing who I was, treated my wounds with care and compassion, showed me kindness I didn't deserve. That's the truth of what happened here." Thomas was very still, his hands clenched at his sides, and Tharacin could see him cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Shock giving way to anger, giving way to something that might have been grief for trust betrayed. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with suppressed emotion. "You lied to me. For 3 weeks you lied about who you were while I treated you, while I wasted medical supplies on you, while I—" He stopped, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration she'd seen before when he was overwhelmed. "Do you have any idea how many people are in this building because of you? Because your forces destroyed their homes, killed their families, turned them into refugees with nowhere else to go." "Yes," Tharacin said quietly. "I know exactly how many. Every settlement my forces attacked, every civilian casualty, every refugee created by military necessity. I know the numbers because I commanded those actions, and I carry responsibility for every single consequence. And you let me save you anyway. Let me help you while you were directly responsible for creating the very suffering I'm trying to heal." The words carried accusation that cut deeper than any weapon. Tharacin's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to respond honestly rather than defensively. "I let you save me because I was dying, and you offered help without conditions. I let you continue helping me because I wanted to understand how someone could maintain compassion in circumstances that should have destroyed it. And I let you befriend me because—" She paused, forcing herself toward vulnerability she rarely showed. "Because you made me feel like a person instead of a weapon, and I'd forgotten what that felt like." "That's not good enough," Thomas said, and his voice broke slightly. "You manipulated me. Used my compassion against me while hiding that you're the enemy, that you're responsible for this entire war. Would you have let me die?" Tharacin asked, the question cutting through his anger. "If you'd known who I was when you found me bleeding in those ruins, injured and helpless, would you have walked away and let me bleed out?" Thomas opened his mouth immediately, probably to say yes, to claim moral clarity that would make this easier. But he stopped, and she saw the internal war on his face, principles against anger, medical ethics against justified rage. Finally, reluctantly, he said, No, I would have treated you anyway. Because I'm a doctor, and I took an oath that doesn't include exceptions for people I disagree with. Then nothing has fundamentally changed, Tharrison said, even though they both knew everything had changed. You are still the healer who saved a life when it mattered. I am still the warrior who was saved. The only difference is now you know my name and the weight it carries. The difference is I trusted you, Thomas said quietly, and the hurt in his voice made her chest ache in ways she hadn't experienced since she was young enough to still feel such things. I thought we were friends, I thought. He cut himself off, shaking his head. It doesn't matter what I thought. You're the Varkari queen, and I'm an idiot who got played. You weren't played, Tharrison insisted, moving closer though she could see him tense at her approach. Everything I showed you was real. My questions about why you do this work, my respect for your dedication, she stopped, uncertain how to articulate something she barely understood herself. You changed how I see things, Thomas Reed. You showed me that mercy isn't weakness, that healing matters as much as fighting, that there are other ways to demonstrate strength beyond conquest. That wasn't manipulation. That was education I desperately needed. And what am I supposed to do with that? Thomas demanded, gesturing helplessly between them. Feel good that the enemy queen learned some lessons about compassion while her forces continued destroying settlements. Pat myself on the back for being a teaching moment. No, Tharrison said. You're supposed to let me repay the debt I owe you, not just for saving my life, but for showing me a perspective I'd never considered, for treating me with dignity when you had no reason to, for being decent when decency should have been impossible in these circumstances. I don't want anything from you except for you to leave, and let me get back to work cleaning up the messes your military decisions create. Then I'll give you something you didn't ask for, Tharrison said, making a decision that would have political consequences she'd deal with later. This facility is now under official Varkari protection. My forces will provide security, supply support, and ensure no Varkari attacks come within 10 kilometers of this location. That's effective immediately and non-negotiable. Thomas stared at her like she'd spoken in a language his translator couldn't process. You're protecting a coalition refugee center. That makes no strategic sense. It makes perfect sense if the goal is proving that Varkari honor includes protecting those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of faction. You taught me that mercy isn't weakness. Let me show my people that lesson has value. I don't want your protection. I don't want anything from you except, Thomas stopped, clearly struggling with what he actually wanted versus what he thought he should want. Except what? Tharrison prompted gently. Except for the war to end, Thomas said finally, voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing. Except for there to be no more refugees, no more destroyed settlements, no more children orphaned by violence that serves political objectives they don't understand. That's what I want. Can you give me that? The question hung between them, challenge and plea in equal measure. Tharrison met his eyes and saw hope there despite the anger, saw him wanting to believe she could be more than just the enemy queen, wanting proof that showing her mercy had mattered. I don't know, she admitted, offering honesty rather than empty promises. The war is complex, with provocations and grievances on both sides going back decades. I can't end it unilaterally. But I can change how Varkari forces conduct themselves. I can implement humanitarian protocols, establish medical neutrality, protect civilian populations instead of considering them acceptable collateral damage. She paused, then added quietly, I can try to be the leader you showed me was possible instead of just the warrior my people expect. But I'll need help doing it. I'll need someone who understands humanitarian principles to teach my commanders what that actually means in practice. You want me to help you reform the Varkari military, Thomas said slowly, disbelief clear in his tone. You want the person whose life work is healing the damage your forces cause to advise you on how to cause less damage. I want the person who saved his enemy and showed her mercy to help me understand how mercy can coexist with strength. Tharasin corrected. I want someone who believes healing matters more than winning to teach that philosophy to warriors who have never considered it. I want, she stopped, then forced herself to vulnerability that terrified her. I want you to help me be better than I've been. Because what I learned here matters, and I don't want to forget it when I return to the capital and political pressures try to pull me back toward pure military solutions. Thomas was quiet for a long time, studying her face like he was searching for deception or manipulation. Finally, he said, "If I agree, and I'm not saying I am, what would that actually look like? I have patients here who need me. I can't just abandon them to advise the enemy." 3 months, Tharasin offered. "Come to the Dominion capital for 3 months. Help me establish humanitarian protocols and train commanders in medical neutrality. If after 3 months you believe it's not working, you return here with no obligations and I ensure this clinic continues to receive protection and support regardless. And if it is working, then maybe we continue. Maybe we save more lives than we end. Maybe we find a path toward peace that neither side has been willing to consider because we were too focused on winning to think about what comes after victory." She held his gaze. "I learned from you, Thomas Reed. Let me show my people what I learned. Let me prove that showing me mercy wasn't a mistake." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Tharasin could see the calculation happening, weighing potential impact against personal cost, idealism against pragmatism, hope against justified cynicism. 3 months, he said finally. "I'll give you 3 months, but I want guarantees for this clinic in writing. I want regular communication with coalition diplomatic channels so they know I'm there voluntarily. And I want the freedom to walk away if I determine you're just using me for propaganda purposes." Done, all of it. Tharasin extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement that she'd learned during her time here. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't waste it." Thomas took her hand, his grip firm despite his lingering anger and hurt. "You're either very brave or very foolish for inviting an enemy into your capital." "Definitely both," Tharasin agreed, echoing the phrase she'd heard him use before. "But someone has to start building bridges. Might as well be the warrior who learned that mercy is possible, and the healer who proved it by showing mercy to someone who probably didn't deserve it." "You deserved it," Thomas said quietly, surprising her. "Not because of anything you'd done, but because everyone deserves medical care when they're dying. That's non-negotiable in my worldview, even when it's complicated by politics and history." They stood together in the clinic, surrounded by refugees who were still processing what they'd witnessed, and Tharasin realized that this moment was inflection point. The place where revenge could become reconciliation, where enemy could become ally, where showing mercy to one person could potentially ripple outward to change entire civilizations. It was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. And as she looked at Thomas's face, still showing hurt but also determination to try despite that hurt, she thought that maybe, just maybe, they could actually do this. Maybe mercy learned could overcome centuries of blood. Maybe a healer and a warrior could find a way to peace that neither could achieve alone. Maybe saving one enemy's life was the first step toward saving thousands more, by teaching the enemy queen that there were alternatives to violence. The galaxy would remember them as the healer who showed mercy without knowing the cost, and the warrior who learned mercy in time to change everything. But first, they had 3 months to prove that the impossible was possible. That enemies could become partners. That showing compassion to someone who didn't deserve it could transform entire civilizations. It wouldn't be easy, but as Thomas had taught her, important things